Welcome, everyone. This is Adrienne Schur from Triumph Learning in New York City. I'm thrilled to see all of you here today from Ghana and Jordan and Mexico and New Jersey and Australia. It's fantastic. I'm particularly glad to be introducing you to our presenter, whom you'll meet in just a moment. Okay, now I just want to tell you a little bit about Jack, who's my colleague and friend here at Triumph Learning. He's our Vice President and Editorial Director of Math and Science. He went to Harvey Mudd College, and he has a Bachelor of Science from there in California, where he's from. He's actually a Northern California native. He also has an MAT from Reed College. Jack's a former teacher of high school mathematics, and he began in High Publishing after being a math teacher. In addition to what he's done so beautifully here at Triumph, he managed the development of several mathematics curricula for Macmillan, Curriculum Concepts, and Metropolitan Teaching and Learning. He's also written a number of mathematics texts, including Voyages, Problem Solving Step by Step, and Metro Math Readers.
Hi, I'm Jack Beers, and I'm glad all you guys could join us this afternoon. We're going to get into talking about differentiating performance tasks. My interest in this whole topic comes from the fact that at Triumph, we produce a lot of materials that are meant to prepare students for state exams. And one of the things we've noticed in the last 2 years is tremendous changes in what's happening with performance tasks on these state tests. Okay, so in this session, I want to take some time at the outset just to talk about the characteristics of performance tasks in math. Many of you may be familiar with performance tasks in other subject areas, and there are some differences in the way they come across in math, in particular in the way they're showing up on state tests these days. So I do want to talk about that to some extent. If you're very familiar with performance tasks already, just bear with us for a few minutes while we go through this. It's background information. We then want to talk about some principles that we can use as educators to adapt performance tasks according to students' different strengths and needs. And then we'll actually work through the thought processes that are involved in making those adaptations. And finally, we'll get to a task where you'll have a chance to utilize that information to modify a performance task yourself. So part one, what's a performance task? Several of the things I'm going to talk about here are taken from the work of Jay McTighe, and so I want to give him credit here. We'll also be talking about some of the variations in the way that they're being implemented at the state level, because as I say, we've seen a lot of changes in performance tasks in state tests. So number one, it's an application of concepts and skills. It is not just a recall type item. But what this looks like is changing a lot, and much of it is because of the instructional shifts that are taking place in mathematics right now. So I just want to take a stroll down the math memory lane for a few minutes. 10 years ago, we were in a situation where educators were debating whether skills or concepts were primary to mathematical learning. And when the National Math Advisory Panel stepped in 2008, they took a close look at this in terms of what the research shows and concluded that this is really a false argument, that teachers really should be teaching both skills and concepts, but they should be focused around problem solving, so that these three are the sort of the three cornerstones of mathematics learning. As we moved ahead from there to the creation of Common Core state standards, we also looked at one of the shifts that was taking place in instruction, and one of those was about rigor. And unlike what many of us were thinking maybe prior to that time, rigor is not so much about providing students with harder computation. It's really about the confluence of conceptual understanding, procedural skill, and applications. So where this comes into this discussion is that performance tasks are really an ideal way of testing rigor, because they address all of these things at once. Another side of rigor that I want to talk about briefly, because this is important in performance tasks, is the different dimensions that we give to a particular concept or skill. And I know many of us in our pre-service learning had learned the Bruner model, which starts with concrete materials, moves to manipulatives, or moves to pictorial, and then to abstract. But in Bruner's later work, and also his work with Richard Lesch, a different model was designed that is really much more contemporary and has a lot to do with what rigor means now. And that is that there really are 5 dimensions to any particular concept or skill that students are learning. In addition to the concrete, the pictorial, and the abstract, students need to be relating this to real-life situations and also to verbal symbols. So the importance of language development has been incorporated into this model. Not only is it important to know all 5 of these aspects of a particular concept, but being able to build the relationships between any 2 of them is key as well. So let's say, for example, we're talking about multiplication at a grade 3 level. The real life situation might be something like Mike made 3 trips of 5 miles. But what we want is for students to be able to relate that concept to the way it's manifested in each of the other 4 manifestations of the concept. So in pictures, we want them to be able to show that on a number line, or with an array, or with a group. With verbal symbols, to use 3 times 5, written symbols, the written correlate of that, and with manipulatives to be able to use counters or linking cubes. With fractions, if we take a look at another concept area, there are a lot of different types of models that we want students to be able to understand. Strip models, number line models, circular models, and area models, and to relate all of those to the symbolic, verbal, real-life context, and in addition, the idea of a fraction as a multiple of a unit fraction. Okay, so secondly, what's characteristic of a performance task? It has some sort of open-ended element in terms of either the method of solution or the answer. So this is an example that I pulled off the TN Ready website for Tennessee. This is a model problem that they provide teachers to prepare students for their state exam. And it concerns Joe going for a hike for 1 week and provides some information about what happened during that hike. Now, one of the things that's particularly different about this problem and can throw students off is that the information is not what they expect to see. If you look at the way it's set up, the information in the table provides the distance not that Joe hiked each day, but the distance from the start of the trail. So, in other words, on day 2, the 30 represents not how far he went on day 2, but how far he went on the first 2 days. So that unusual set is something that makes the problem different. But where it's open-ended is that there's different methods that students can use to work toward the solution of the problem. Once they realize that the total distance Joe hiked in 7 days is 120 miles, it might be that a student could use their number sense to come up with an approximate number for how many miles he hiked per day. Another way a student might approach that would be to actually compute the different distances that Joe hiked each day and then use those numbers as a way of answering the problem. So this is open-ended in the sense that there's a lot of different approaches students can use to solve the problem. This is a second example, and I'll be talking about this at some length as we go further into this discussion. But this is a performance task that I took from some of our company's materials involving building a school garden. This would be at a 3rd or 4th grade level. So in this case, your group has been asked to design a garden that will be planted in your local park, and there are some parameters to what's going on here. The garden will be a rectangle. Each side of the garden has to be 2 to 5 yards in length, and the area of the garden will be 75 to 150 square feet. Now, this is open-ended by virtue of the fact that it imposes restrictions rather than giving exact dimensions to what you need to compute. So you notice the task does not specify whether to draw a diagram, whether to find the area, whether to find the area in square feet or square yards, or even how to find the area. So it's a very open-ended type of task. Okay, third, performance tasks employ a fresh, realistic context. And the reason for this is we don't want students in a performance task to be drawing on an old mindset. We don't want them to be saying, oh, I've seen this problem before. All I have to do is crank it out. It's fresh in the sense that we want them to reset their mind. So from the example I showed from the Tennessee performance task, what was fresh there is that the information was given in a very different way. And it sort of stops students, gets them to reset and think about, what am I really looking at here? From a realistic point of view, it's important that students connect with the task in a way that they don't do it mechanically, but think more about how this feels to them in real life. So, for example, we don't want to be supplying units that have fifths of inches or something like that. We want it to have a realistic feel in terms of what's really going on in the activity. Okay, so if you look at what's going on in this particular school garden activity, you can see that there's a lot that's fresh and new. It has a very realistic feel to it also, and it's not going to be a problem that students have solved before. Fourth, performance tasks require a transfer of understanding to a new situation. And I guess in real life, we see this happening all the time. I'm thinking in sports, for example. Last night we had the National Football Championship, and the preparation for that is a really difficult thing for those teams to do because in addition to their skills, practicing tackling and blocking and pass receiving and so forth, they also have to find a way to deal with what's a new situation in a game. So, for example, the Alabama defense had to deal with a quarterback who runs the ball differently than most of the teams they've been up against. So those teams prepare by scrimmaging, where they actually run plays that they expect against their defense that they expect the other team to use as well. Another example from women's athletics is the Connecticut women's basketball team has a very long success record, and one of the things that they do in preparing is they scrimmage against themselves in practice. Some of the players say those are the most difficult games they ever play. But the way this looks in mathematics is a little different. Going back to the school garden example, the transfer here is between the types of information that we're providing for the students and the task of planting the garden. So if you look at the information that's in this problem, there's information about a shape, namely the rectangle, about the attributes of that shape. That's something that they're going to have to know. In this case, the attributes we give them are length and area. And there's also needed information about equivalences because they're going to have to be transferring information from yards to feet, feet to yards, square yards to square feet. So a lot of transfer in a task like this. Fifth, a task like this is, all performance tasks are multifaceted. It is not just simply one problem, but they tend to access, depending upon where the jurisdiction is where it shows up, either multiple standards or multiple facets of a particular standard. And when I say multiple standards, these are not usually standards that are all over the place. They're usually standards that are part of one cluster of standards within a particular domain. But we'll see some examples of performance tasks that use one approach or the other approach as we go through this. So multifaceted also deals with the fact that about how they're put together. And I've had a lot of interesting discussions recently with people about what this looks like in certain state tests. Because on some state tests, the performance tasks are structured to explore a series of parts that are related to the ultimate product. In other words, they build up to the culminating activity. In other cases, the parts in the performance task are really designed to develop understanding, or at least to assess understanding, of the different competencies that will be needed to solve that task without specifically addressing the task itself. So we'll see some examples. It's a little bit abstract, but we'll see some examples of both of those. Okay, so now if we look at what's happening in this Tennessee Ready example where Joe went for a hike, part A in that particular task, I had shown you before the culminating part of the task, but part A says Joe walked more miles on day 1 than on day 2. Is this true or false? Well, as students look at this, there are a couple of ways that they can discern what the answer is. Some students might look at that and say, well, I'll subtract 30 minus 15 and 1/8 and actually do the computation. Other students might use their number sense and look at that and say, well, the first day he walked a little over 15, so I know he must have walked a little under 15 the second day because I only get to 30. So those are two different approaches, and in this case, those two different approaches mirror the approaches that could be used in the ultimate task. So it's a way that the beginning task can sort of set up the understandings that are needed for the later one. Let's look down at the bottom here. Joe walked the most miles on day 7. Well, if you look at day 7, you can see that between day 6 and day 7, there must have been a little under 20 miles walked, whereas between day 5 and day 6, about 20 miles were walked. So that's, again, a question that you could answer either by estimation or by computation. The second part of this task asks how many miles in all did Joe walk on day 5? Enter your answer in the box in decimal form. Well, this is a little different because none of the tasks that we looked at before actually required a transformation between fractions and decimals. So even though that's probably not something that will come up in the eventual culminating activity, here it's something that falls in the same cluster of standards as the other skills that are going on here. So it's an example of where a portion of the activity was put in there that develops a related standard but not the standard that's involved in the culminating activity. Okay, here's part C, which has students complete a statement, and there's a pull-down menu for this that involves whether Joe walked a few miles more, a few miles less, and involves really a two-step problem. So this sets students up for a multi-step problem, which is what they'll be involved with Part D. Okay, and then we're back to Part D here, which we looked at earlier. So in the case of Joe going hiking, the skills that were involved were adding mixed numbers, estimating sums and differences, solving multi-step problems, representing fractions as decimals, and then also reasoning about conclusions. So the preliminary activities set up several of these different skills that would be involved in the culminating activity. Okay, lastly, among the characteristics of a performance task, they do require a rubric for evaluation. And I'm sure many of you have seen different types of rubrics. One of the types of rubrics that's frequently used is a rubric that's holistic, where maybe different dimensions of the student's response are being evaluated. For example, there may be a certain number of points for mathematical accuracy, a certain number of points for the explanation that comes with the answer. On state assessments, these are not the types of rubrics that we normally see. The rubrics are usually ones that involve decomposing the total score into smaller pieces that then can be summed up. So this is an example I pulled off the Smarter Balance website. It's a sample item. And the rubric that's attached to this has several parts to it. So first of all, there's a piece where there's a 2-point rubric put on it, and there's a criterion for the student scoring 2 points, for 1 point, and for 0 points. Then there's a second part that has a 1-point rubric. And so the sum of the rubrics for each of those parts is the way that the student is scored. Now, one of the reasons I bring this up is because when you alter a performance task, you absolutely must rethink the rubric. The rubric is the very last thing that you should create after you have a performance task that's in place. Okay, that's background in terms of performance tasks. Now let's go under the hood and actually look at what this looks like with adapting a performance task to a particular audience. So I'm going to talk about different principles we can use, and I credit Carol Tomlinson for her work in this area. I'm going to draw heavily on it in terms of tiered assessments, but pretty much what we can do is we can scaffold an existing task for learners who are struggling with foundational skills. We can augment the task to make it more challenging, and we can offer alternate ways of showing understanding. However, I'll tell you that this is a more common approach in English language arts than it is in mathematics, because the actual product in mathematics, at least what I found, is normally on state tests, they will specify what the nature of the product is. One of the reasons I mentioned starting with an existing task and building it from there is that many of the good tasks that are out there now were not built in the last 2 or 3 years, and they don't look anything like the assessments that states are putting out. So I think that usually the most productive way of going about creating a good performance task is to find a piece of a performance task, a culminating activity that you really like, and build it from there. Just adapt it to the audience that you have. So these are the questions that we want to ask before we get going in order to plan a performance task. We want to ask, what do students currently know and what can they do? Then you want to think about where you want to get them to, how big that gap is, because you don't want to try and stretch kids across a gap that is going to be too challenging for them. But you also don't want to leave them in a place where it's not a difficult reach for them. You always want to be stretching your students. So lastly, how do I ensure that the gap is just right so it challenges the students in a way that maximizes learning? So these are the ways that we can do that. We can start by designing a task that's at grade level to demonstrate proficiency and independently. And then if we want to adapt that to increase the challenge, some of the ways that we can do that are to decrease the structure, offer more choice, and a greater level of sophistication. And on the other hand, if we want to adapt or modify a task to reduce the challenge, usually what we want to do is to put more structure into that, to guide it more narrowly, less choice and less sophistication. Okay, so for an on-level task, we will refer to it as such. For struggling learners, we'll call it a scaffolded task. And also, for one that's providing an additional level of challenge, we'll refer to that as an augmented task. I do see some questions coming up about the tasks themselves, and I think I'll get back to them in a little while, but I want to go ahead and lay the outline for these different approaches first. Now, when we're trying to work with students who are struggling, very important that we realize that the scaffolds we provide have to be bringing them up to grade level. So I love this visual metaphor because on the left what we have is a little kid who can't see over the wall, because his support is the same level as the others. And on the right, he's got an extra box so he can see over the wall. And one of the things that's great about this particular metaphor is when we think about what it's saying, it's saying that scaffolds are a temporary thing. When a student needs a scaffold, just like this little guy on the right, he's not going to need that forever. It's something he's going to need until he gets bigger and can actually see over the wall himself. But it also reminds us that what we want to do is to get the student up to the same level as everybody else by providing them with the support that they need. So now let's take a look at the school garden performance task and think about what's challenging about the way the problem is posed. So I want you to just think about this for a minute, and if you're with someone else, you can talk about what you see is what you think is going to be difficult for kids in terms of solving this problem. Now, some of the things to think about are what do you see going on in terms of computation? What do you see in terms of understandings that they have to bring to this problem? What do you see in terms of the way things are represented here? Are there things that kids could use some help with? Okay, let's now talk about this a little bit. Some of the background knowledge that the students are going to need is to know how many feet are in a yard. We talk about area here, so they're going to need to understand what a square yard is. They're going to need to understand what a square foot is. The comparison between square feet and square yards, that's also something that's going to come into this problem. We mentioned a rectangle as the shape, so students are going to need to know how to find the area of a rectangle from the dimensions. So this is the first step, is to identify what that background knowledge is that students are going to have to know. Once I've identified that, I can create a readiness task for the beginning of this original culminating task. So what I might do is go back and think about how to ask students questions that will get at whether they understand those concepts that they need to solve the problem. So my first part could be to have them draw a diagram to show the number of square feet that are equal to 1 square yard and explain their answer. And then I could set it up like this, and I might even want to provide a grid as a background if I think that that's something they're going to need. And once they've done that, I would hope to get something like this that would show me that students can see what a foot is, they know what a square foot is, and from the diagram, they're able to see that there are 9 square feet in 1 square yard. This is going to help students avoid the really common mistake of thinking that there are 3 square feet in a square yard. So it's a check, and it's a way of kind of getting them focused and going the right direction that helps them get through part of the problem. Okay, a second part might be for me to see how good they are at actually working with that information to find the area. For example, they may have some misconceptions about how the dimensions of the rectangle can be used to find the area. So I could have them select which of these rectangles have an area of 24 square feet. And I can give them information that gives the correct answer in verbal form. I can give them a diagram so I can see if they understand it from a diagram. And I can also give them some examples that reflect the misconception where they're actually finding perimeter rather than area. Okay, now let's turn this over to the other side and think about what I could do to bump up this challenge. So what could I do to decrease the structure or increase the choice? is there a way I can add an additional constraint? I want to make this a little bit higher cognitively, but I also want to do it in a way that will be accessible to all the kids. There'll be some students that maybe can do better, but would be accessible to everybody. So, so one of the things I could do is to take out drawing a diagram of the garden and have them figure out how to solve the problem without actually having a diagram. I could also have them work at finding a maximum result or a minimum result. I could also provide an opportunity for students to consider other types of units to solve the problem. So if I decided to change this to one where they find the maximum area, I could ask the question, find the largest garden you can build in terms of area. Now, this is not going to be a task that excludes all the students, because if a student can come up with one solution to it, that's at least a start. But if I ask for a maximum area, then what I might find is that some students would come up with something like this. They would realize that 150 is the target for this particular maximum, and if they play around a little and try some different dimensions, maybe they would come up with something that's 15 by 10. So in this case, there's a unique answer, but there doesn't have to be a unique answer. And for example, I could even bump this up a little farther and make this a little bit more challenging for students by saying, label your drawing with the length and the width of the garden in yards. Okay, now what's going to happen here? Take a look at this and you realize that the dimensions of the garden are given in yards, but the target area is given in square feet. So this is going to be a more challenging problem, and the types of numbers students are working with are a little different. Okay, so maybe something like this might happen. A student might try this and try 5 yards and 3 yards, realize that's 15 square yards, and come up with 135 square feet. It's a good answer. It's not the best answer. But the fact that it's a more open problem at this point gives students an opportunity to try several different things, to really muck around and see what they can come up with. So maybe after a little bit more time, or a different student tries 4 yards and 4 yards, and this time comes up with 16 square yards or 144 square feet. Another good answer. It doesn't get to the maximum of 150, but with integral values for the measurements, this is as high as you can get. So those are two good answers, and it tells you something about the student's thinking. But think for a minute. We had already solved this problem with units of feet, and we're able to get 150 square feet. So there's a solution out there somewhere to this problem that some students might think of and others might not. And if a student goes a little bit further and can think back to the fact that there may actually be fractional units, they could come up with what we had seen earlier, which is that 10 by 15 would be a solution to that. Now, you may also have a student who says, I know it's 5 feet by a little more than 3, but they're not prepared to come up with the exact units. Hey, that's a great answer. But all of these answers are going to give you an opportunity to look deeper into the understanding that your students have of this particular activity. I want to take a second task and look at this, because the approach we're going to use here to finding the foundational supports is going to be just slightly different. Here we've got Ross having 21 stickers, so we've got an odd number here, and he bought some new stickers, and now he's got an even number of stickers. So we have to decide, or the students have to decide, if the new packet has an odd number of stickers or an even number of stickers. Okay, so think just for a second about what's going on here. What concepts are involved? Well, if I look at the on-level standard for grade 3, here's what it looks like. It says identify arithmetic patterns, including patterns in the addition or multiplication table, and explain them using properties of operations. So something that would be on level for this particular task is looking at patterns of even and odd, seeing that if you add an even number and an even number, you get an even number, and an even and an odd, you get an odd. But if I've got students that are struggling with that, it may be because they're still at a level that is not the third grade level. So I can take a look back and compare it to the foundational standard that came from grade 2. Because all of the Common Core standards and most of the state standards are structured in this way so that there's a coherent sense of growth in the standards from one level to the next. Now, when I look at the grade 2 standard, what I'm seeing is that it says determine whether a group of objects has an odd or even number of members by pairing objects or counting them by twos. So, what I could do in this case to build a foundational scaffolding task is go back and say, decide whether Ross started with an odd number of stickers or an even number. Draw a picture or give an explanation to show how you know. This is a way of drawing on the foundational knowledge that we know kids have to have in order to perform well on this task. Okay, I could also ask, suppose the new packet of stickers has an even number. Would the total that Ross has now be even or odd? Explain how you know. So these are similar to the tasks we looked at earlier that are foundations that are building up to the culminating task. To build an augmented task here, I could look at something that is more complex. I'm going to stick with the same standard, but I might ask something like this. Rena had 3 packets of stickers. The total number of stickers she had was an even number. Does this mean that she has an even number of stickers in each packet? Justify your conclusion. Now, this becomes higher level because a couple of things are at play here. One is it involves students generalizing about what's in the original task from two events to 3 events. The other is that it probably involves, a good answer involves some sort of looking at different cases. So there are going to be students who say, well, it's going to be even because if all 3 are even, then it's even. But they may be overlooking the fact that if 2 are odd and 1 is even, then you still get an even sum. So this is another way you can open up or augment the task. Okay, those are both background items, and I wanted to now give you a chance to work on performance task. I've set one up here with a prompt and a part D, which is the culminating part. And I want to give you about 5 minutes to look at this and think about these questions. I want you to ask yourself, step 1, solve the problem yourself. This is always the first place to start with a performance task. And as you do so, you can decide what skills students need to know to solve the problem. Okay, then after that, what I'd like you to do is to think about which scaffolds you could create for parts A, B, and C to prepare students for part D. And we'll come back in just a few minutes and we'll talk about, I wish I could share all the ones that you're doing, but I'll share some samples of things that we've put together that might be scaffolds. If you have time, I'd like you also to think about what you might do to augment this task at the end. And a way to think about that is how can you open it up? How can you provide an opportunity for generalization or perhaps solving by cases or something like that, make it a more complex task. So we'll take about 4 minutes to work on this. And I think while you're working on that, I'm just going to muse a little bit about some of the things that we might think about as we're going along here. You know, I'm just thinking that as I look at this, one of the things I'd ask myself is what operations are involved here? as I'm working it through, I'd say, what am I doing to compute? So what operations are involved? I think I'd also look at, let's see, how the information from these different snack packs could be put together in a two-step problem, because we want kids to be able to do two-step problems. I think I'd also think about whether I can scaffold by creating an easier version of the culminating problem, something that would be related but would help expose to me if students are just having some difficulty translating the word problem situation into numerical calculation. I think I'd also think about whether my students are going to have any difficulty organizing the information here. If there's something I could do, could I create a table or something to help them organize it? And maybe if that's the case, I could create a task that might help them in that way. Okay, I think I am going to move ahead. Some of you guys are probably still working, but let's take a look. Well, certainly one thing I could do is see if the students are able to translate the information they have in the contextual example into just computation. So I could ask which of these are ways that you could represent what's going on in that problem. I could take a smaller task and just ask, how much did Ramon spend on peach snack packs? So this is just a very direct computational problem. See if they can get to the solution of that. I could also see if they can put together a two-step problem, and something like this where I compare the amounts that were spent on peach snack packs and apple snack packs, and see if they come up with $1 more, $1 less, $5 more, $5 less. Because the ultimate problem itself is a two-step problem. Okay, so I hope you guys did well on that. I wanted to take a minute to look at something that is maybe something we have to be careful about. This is a tiered assessment, which is a pattern type problem, and involves the gumball machine where you put in a penny and you get out 3 gumballs, put in 2 and you get out 5. So it's a pattern where you get an increase of 2 for each additional penny you put in. Now, in the more accessible version that I found of this, it was adapted for struggling learners by reducing the numbers. So we're changing, put in 1 penny, you get 2 gumballs. Put in 2, you get 3, and so forth. And also the last step was taken out. What I think is missing the point here is that going back to that picture we had of the little kid and what we're talking about scaffolding, is that this is really making it more accessible by reducing the challenge for students. So rather than do this, I would suggest that you think about what it is that they're going to struggle with in this activity and then try and provide some support for that. One of the ways that you could do that would be to look at the solutions that your students are providing to problems like that. So this is a solution that one kid had where he tried drawing a picture to organize the information, but just wasn't getting it right. He was just having a real difficult time. So one of the things that we might be able to do then is to provide a scaffold in which we help them to organize the information. So if we say make a table to show the number of gumballs you get if you put in 1, 2, 3, or 4 pennies, now they're going to get 1, 2, 3, and 4 across the top, but they're going to get a sequence of odd numbers along the bottom. And just organizing it, as I noticed some of you were suggesting about that last activity, is a great way to help kids. It's always going to be something that is a support that's going to help strugglers. So just to summarize the whole task alteration process, where you start is with a prompt for the task and a culminating task, and then as you change the task, you do it by building some scaffold tasks that lead up to the culminating task, and then also look at an augmented task. We didn't have a chance to talk about augmentations for that task that we were working on, but just to suggest a couple, you could maximize the sale. For example, if Ramon had $25 for more lunches, you could ask what's the greatest number of snack packs he could buy. You could also have kids look at different cases. If I said, next time he went to the store, he spent $18, what could he have bought? There's different answers to that. So there are a lot of ways that we could take the same kinds of augmentations we saw in the earlier items and apply them to this particular situation. So I just want to go back and address the objectives we had. We wanted to look at 3 questions. What are the characteristics of performance tasks? Also, the principles we can use, which I think are pretty straightforward. It's don't reduce expectations. We need to find a way to get kids to where they need to be, whether it's going farther or moving slower, but don't reduce expectations. And lastly, I'd scaffold on-level tasks by changing the amount of structure, and also if you're extending, you can change the amount of structure. And I think the thought process that I would describe in going through that is start by thinking about what the background knowledge is that students come with. And you can find that either by looking back along the standards that they've learned in previous grades, or by just solving the problem and thinking about what you need. Secondly, how you can change the structure. And lastly, how students will respond to the new task. So that's the presentation. I want to go back to questions now.
Hey, Jack.
Yes.
So I have some of the questions that came up during your webinar.
Great.
And one of them is about rubrics. Do you
Yes.
provide students with a rubric prior to the task?
Yes, I think students should be provided with a rubric prior to the task. I think it's helpful for students to know what the target is that they're shooting for. And as a matter of fact, if you're using performance tasks as formative assessments, it's a really great idea to get kids to look over the rubric in advance of solving it, so they know what they need to do. I would definitely provide them with a rubric.
And so by doing that, you involve them in the evaluation process. Are there other ways that you involve them in the evaluation process?
I want to give an anecdote to that. I had a class years ago where I didn't realize at first that many of the students thought that the way they were assessed was whether the teacher liked them or not. And it took me a while to understand that by actually letting them see the process by which they're evaluated, they come to trust and believe that it's really about how they perform and not about whether you like them or not. I think, but Adrian, to get back to your question, are there other ways that we can evaluate them? I'm sorry, was that the question?
How else might you involve them in the evaluation process?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think certainly after you have had them work on a performance task, you should have them be able to look over how you've evaluated it.
So look at your comments on the rubric or where you've marked them on the rubric?
Exactly, right, because if you're evaluating it, it's a good thing to share with students. I mean, part of the value of the formative assessment is for you as a teacher to know where kids are struggling, but a big part of it is for them to know what they still need to work on.
Right. Yes, that makes complete sense. So here's another question. It's interesting. You said that one of the characteristics of a performance task is that there isn't a prescribed outcome, that there isn't one right answer, if you will.
Well,
okay, go ahead.
What I said is that there's some element of open-endedness. Sometimes the element of open-endedness is in the route to a unique solution. Sometimes it's that there is no unique solution. And I think you you can develop tasks that fit in either of those situations. But in actuality, I think more often than not in mathematics, the tasks do have a specific ending or a specific answer. But
Okay.
I mean, we saw some examples today of ones that don't.
Right.
But in every case, I think there was an openness either about the pathway to the solution or about the solution itself.
Okay. That makes sense.
Here's a question someone had. Would you ever have students look at each other's work and use the rubric to figure out the grade ahead of time? It's a great idea. I think that's a great idea.
Okay. So, and here's one. My performance tasks are done in order to assess my students' understanding in order to move forward. Now, what's challenging is to create different performance tasks under the same learning target in order to approach different learning styles.
Uh-huh.
So visual, kinesthetic, I assume that's what they mean by that.
I would assume that too.
Yeah.
Well, I think that one of the ways that could happen, it's a really interesting question. In performance tasks for English language arts, there's a lot of variety in terms of the final product. And they're often adapted by allowing students to provide a different kind of final product that it would go along with their particular learning style.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to, in mathematics, it might be that we can address, if you think back to the example we had of different ways of looking at whether students understand area. One of the ways of approaching that might be to have choices that include ones with language, ones that ways of representing something with a drawing or a model. So you get at the different representations, because the representations of a concept usually vary from visual to verbal, and I guess tactile as well if you're talking about using manipulatives to show something. So maybe it would be including choices for a way to solve something that would involve using a model, using a verbal description, or using manipulatives to show something.
Those are great, Jack. Yeah. I think that we're at 4:01, so I think that's all the time we have. But I can post some of these in our discussion board, Jack, and I can hound you, since I'm next door to you,
Okay.
come in
That
and
sounds
answer
great.
some of those. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. And keep in mind, these are things that you can do yourself. There are good materials out there, but if you find a good learning task, a good performance task, if you get in there and apply these principles, you can scaffold them for some of your learners and you can augment them for others. So just remember, you can do it.